time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, Peter Knutson. Peter Knutson is professor of environmental anthropology at Seattle Central College. He is also commissioner at the Puget Sound Salmon Commission and founding fisherman at Loki Fish Company. And he's back to give us an update on last summer's collapse of a farmed Atlantic salmon facility up in the San Juan Islands. Peter, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Well, thanks for making it possible.
So start out, tell us a little bit about Loki Fish Company and the Puget Sound Salmon Commission.
Right. Well, we're just, Loki Fish Company is our small family business. We probably got 6 or 7 people that work in the business, and my son fishes. My other son ran the business for a while. We market at co-ops up and down Puget Sound, do the farmers markets here in Seattle. We do some Midwest co-ops. So it's all direct marketing, high quality handling on the boat. And I feel good as a fisherman taking responsibility for that fish all the way from the water to the consumer. It just makes me feel good to treat those fish with respect. The Puget Sound Salmon Commission, which I'm not speaking for today, but I am a longtime commissioner in the Washington State Department of Agriculture. That's actually a commodities commission that does things to enhance and augment our small boat fisheries here in Puget Sound. We do toxicology studies. We actually found out that the local Kita salmon are very clean. We tested them for PCBs, PBDEs, mercury. They came out the cleanest of all the local fish, which is our healthiest salmon run right now. We also try to get underutilized species to the consumer, consumer education. We've got a website at soundcatch.org. So it's a good group. It's self-funded by the small boat gillnetters here in the non-treaty gillnetters here in Puget Sound. They pay 2% of their catch to fund this program.
All right, so we have just had developments this week in regards to legislation regarding a facility, a major facility that collapsed this last August. You were on then to talk about that, but maybe you can update for us what occurred in August with the Cook Aquaculture facility.
Yeah, well, first of all, this is really exciting what's going on in Olympia right now. We actually got powerful legislation passed in the Senate, and the governor has expressed his support. And right now, we're fighting the battle in the House, basically to phase out the farming of this exotic species, Atlantic salmon, here in Puget Sound. So that's the immediate context. Going backwards, we had a collapse. There are, I think, 8 pens in Puget Sound. They're all owned by one company based in Canada. They're actually global, called Cook Aquaculture. I think they're privately held. I think I read that they're about a $5 billion corporation. I might be overstating, but I think that's about right.
They paint themselves as a mom and pop shop, though.
Yeah, I know. I saw a picture of their CEO testifying someplace, and he had on like a farmer's cat, like he was straight from Kansas or something. It's not the case. They've had a lot of issues on the east coast of the U.S., or I'm sorry, the east coast of Canada, and they operate in other places. They're actually doing some land-based facilities they're funding on the east coast of Canada, which really is the only ecologically sane way to do what they're doing, which is raising these domesticated Atlantic salmon. Currently, I mean, the way this industry operates, they set up these open net cage pens out in the wild marine ecosystem, and then the feed that they feed those fish, or any antibiotics they throw in, or any pesticides, that all goes out in the ambient marine environment, and of course affects all the other organisms. The benthic layer, crabs, they'll pick up this thing. They pick up whatever diseases are coming out, and that's one of the big concerns globally about this industry, is the transmission of disease to wild fish. Even in the birthplace of this industry, the farm salmon industry, which is Norway, big movements in Norway to try to remove these things from the water because they're destroying their native stocks over there. So I was just coming back from Alaska in the middle of August when I heard the news that there'd been this collapse at Cypress Island, which is just north of Anacortes. And it was initially, it was right after the time there was an eclipse, and the company claimed, oh, it was because of the eclipse. And of course, this was the first of many excuses that turned out to be totally bogus that they threw out. At first they said, oh, it's just a few fish, it's not much. Gee, we had no idea this was happening. Then they said it was, I don't know, maybe 100,000, and now apparently the number of escapees has doubled. So there's just a litany of misrepresentations that this company has put out. And also, it turns out that they had a heads up that this facility was collapsing sometime earlier. And because they had a bunch of maturing fish, thousands inside this pen, they just figured, well, screw it, we'll just go ahead and not do anything and just harvest these fish. Well, bingo, they didn't make it. Turned out that the net pens that they had were just covered in mussels, huge tidal resistance. The tides weren't even that extreme, and it was just a complete collapse. And so we've seen what's happening now, which is that these fish, the fish farmers say, well, what's the problem with exotic species? You've got clams, you've got mussels. Well, they don't have tails. And these fish, within a week of leaving, were being picked up 150 miles north in British Columbia. Now, as recently as about a month ago, we found escaped Atlantics way up in the Skagit River. So it's a very, very serious threat to the marine ecosystem. And it flies in the face of, the treaty commitments that we have with Native Americans, that they signed those treaties, gave away this land down here in exchange for fishing rights. And the courts have ruled that fishing rights have no meaning if you have no habitat, if you have no fish. And so they have rights to protect their resource, and they're using them. And all 23 of the treaty tribes have come out in favor of removing these pens from our ecosystem. I mean, salmon's critical to the tribes. Of course, it's critical to the whole ecosystem we've got here in Puget Sound. After the last ice age, 10, 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers receded and the land was barren, it was the salmon that came back from the ocean that began to fertilize the streams and regenerate the ecosystem. So salmon, wild salmon, are absolutely critical, not just as a food source for humans, but in terms of, we're finding their signatures. They bring chemical signatures from the ocean, and we find them in old-growth trees. So it ties the whole web together. It's absolutely central to our ecosystem. So to put an invasive species in the middle of that and threaten that is just, well, I guess it's sort of classic capitalist lunacy, isn't it? I mean, essentially, you've got a sustainable livelihood, and you're going to put that at risk for some short-term jobs, and just a handful of jobs. So it doesn't make sense. And these are the kinds of battles that fishing-dependent communities are fighting all the way from Bristol Bay with the Pebble Mine, all through British Columbia, where you've got the First Nations that are leading the fight against these invasive net pens. People like Alexandra Morton up there, who's done a lot of the science research on it. And then you've got people in Iceland, Norway, other places that are fighting. Ireland. We just find Chile. All over the world, we're resisting this sort of blue revolution, which is not really about feeding people. It's really about generating money from a first world clientele. That's the whole goal for these companies.
Well, another of the myths that Cook floated early on was that these farmed Atlantic salmon wouldn't survive on their own once they got past that eroding fence that they had built.
They continue to claim that there's no evidence that these fish can colonize and successfully establish themselves. there's been research done in British Columbia on Vancouver Island by John Volpe, who was a professor at University of Victoria, and he found, I can't remember the percentage, I think it was around 20 to 25% of the streams he surveyed had evidence of successful Atlantic colonization. Now, of course, one thing the companies will say is that, well, gee whiz, your Department of Fisheries here in Washington State, they intentionally tried to release Atlantics 40, 50 years ago to create a sport fishery, which says something about their mentality. But they weren't successful at that time. But the difference now is that many of these streams are underpopulated by wild fish. And it takes repeated attempts before these invasive species sometimes can take. And why take that risk? And it's not just the colonization that these Atlantics may perform in our streams. Probably most important and most frightening is the potential for disease transmission. And this has become one of the central issues in this fish farming technology, is that, it's just like a feedlot with cattle, or it's just like a bunch of kindergartners all together. One kid gets sick, they all get sick. And here you've got 10,000 fish in a football field. And they are tracking viruses, which their genetic signature, they can see some of these came from Norway. And in British Columbia now, you've got a new disease called Piscine reovirus, which leads to heart and skeletal muscle inflammation and the death of the fish, and huge problem in Norway. And they haven't yet documented what we call HSMI, heart and skeletal muscle inflammation, in the wild fish yet, but they have documented and strongly correlated Piscine reovirus, which is ubiquitous in the pens in the wild fish in British Columbia. And the correlations are really strong. The closer the wild fish population is to the net pen, the higher percentage of what we call PRV infected fish you find. And then they tracked these fish up into the upper reaches of the Fraser, and they found that the percentage of virus-infected wild fish dropped radically, which is not a good sign, because what that means is that the fish that had it were not fit and couldn't make it to the upper reaches. And so this is brand new research, just got published in PLOS about a month and a half ago. It's called The Effect of Exposure to Farm Salmon on Piscine orthoreovirus infection and fitness in wild Pacific salmon. It's a long title, but the import of the research, which is over 1,000 fish they surveyed, is that very strong correlation between the presence of fish farms and the presence of this new disease in wild fish. And that spreads like wildfire. Sure, the companies say, oh, they can't survive in the wild. Well, there's been lots of documentation in British Columbia. And, what are those fish doing up in the Skagit River? What is this, almost 6 months after the escape? Or not 6 months, maybe 5 months? They're not feeding? Well, somehow their metabolism must be doing something to survive. So, but in any case, it's inappropriate. If you want to do this kind of domesticated agriculture, put it on land where you can control your externalities. Instead, they don't want to do that because it raises their costs. So instead, they want to be subsidized by the destruction of the wild ecosystem. And so, that's just a quick and dirty summary of the major problems with this industry.
Well, and similar to industrial hog farming, these farmed fish facilities, don't they crank out an incredible amount of waste that is just going directly into the water there?
Right. When divers go beneath these pens, they usually find a dead zone. Oftentimes, you can, if you watch some of the documentaries on YouTube about this, like, say, Salmon Confidential is a good one. There's another one called Filet-O-Fish that was done by the Europeans about toxins in farm salmon. But if you watch those, they will actually have footage underneath those pens of just basically dead zones that are just loaded with detritus, and so there's no containment. Everything goes out into the ambient marine ecosystem. The feces, the uneaten feed, whatever toxins you're using to treat for pesticides, that kind of thing. So yeah, and the irony is that had this escape in Cyprus not happened and really foregrounded this in terms of the public, we'd be seeing a massive expansion in Washington State of this industry right now. They had, Cook had applications into the Department of Natural Resources to radically expand their footprint out in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, not far from the Elwha River that we just tore the dams off and are restoring. And that was being fast-tracked, and they've got the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, whose part of its charge is to support this aquaculture. And so they had federal tailwind. They didn't seem to have any opposition. But we've known for years about the disease problem, but it didn't reach critical mass in terms of public awareness till now.
And talk a little bit about the economics, both financial and environmental, of supporting farm salmon. Doesn't it really take, I mean, they're carnivorous, don't they really end up consuming other fish to survive?
That's right. Now, when the industry puts out its propaganda, they'll say, "Oh, we're almost to a no net loss." In other words, no net loss of protein. They say, we're getting 1 pound of farm salmon for 1.2 pounds of feed. What they don't tell you is how many pounds of wild fish it takes to get to that 1 pound of feed. Now the Chileans have done studies on this. In 2005, 2004. There was a foundation called the TERRAM Foundation, TERRAM, a Chilean foundation that actually looked at the feed conversion efficiency of farm salmon, and their conclusion was that it takes about 9.9 pounds of wild captured fish to make 1 pound of farm salmon on the other end. Now, of course, the industry is going to dispute that, but they did a lot of research on this. A good resource on the web on this is called Salmon Piranha Style, Feed Conversion Efficiency in the Chilean Salmon Farm Industry, put out by the Chileans about 6 or 7 years ago. So yeah, it has a protein reduction. It's worse than cattle. I mean, cattle, essentially, you're dumping in massive amounts of water and grain, corn, and of course they're switching over the farm salmon industry to more land-based grains to reduce their costs. Of course, as they do that, the omega-3 levels in the salmon flesh decline as well. So, but still, it's a protein reduction fishery, and they will bald-faced tell you, well, we're into this to deal with problems of world hunger, as if they're going to sell this farm salmon in the poor colonized sections of the planet, in Latin America, Africa, Asia. But they'll put that out there. It sounds good. It's a good sound bite.
Like they do with genetically modified organisms.
Right, exactly. Of which salmon was the first one approved by the FDA. It was basically rammed through, and now they're actually selling genetically modified fish, where they've transplanted some genes from a pout, a king salmon, into Atlantic. So they grow big, they don't have seasonality, and they're just like great big fish balloons that grow up, and they're putting them out. And of course, in our country, we do not have labeling, which requires them to label it as genetically modified. We came close here in this state, but we got sabotaged by illegal campaign contributions by the grocery stores. I don't know if you recall that or not.
Vaguely.
Yeah, but so anyways, there's really, there are ancient forms of aquaculture which you could argue are sustainable. I mean, the Chinese for eons have raised fish on farms, but it's always conversion of grain or agricultural waste into fish flesh, and there's a role for that. There's a role for that, but that's not what this is about. There's a role for shellfish aquaculture, which actually helps to clean the sound. They're filter feeders. This is very different. This is a bunch of carnivorous fish that you're having to go out and send fleets out to harvest anchoveta, other feed, and bring them in, reduce them to a pellet, and then feed them to these fish, all to sell to a first world clientele. That's what it's about.
So since that accident in August and the media attention on it, then there has been some movement here in Washington State.
Yeah,
I believe Hillary France made the first official step to try and.
We've got. It turns out we have a commissioner of public lands that has some backbone, and the first lease that she canceled was at Port Angeles because they were allowing styrofoam to disintegrate. They were anchoring outside of their leased area, and the whole industry is paying the state just a pittance for this stuff. I mean, we're spending way more regulating it than we're getting. And then I think it was about 2 weeks ago, maybe a week and a half ago, she came out and canceled their lease at the Cypress Island site. It turned out that they didn't pick up any of the wreckage. It turned out that they hadn't cleaned the nets, that they were just loaded with stuff. And they lied repeatedly. So now we've got movement in the legislature, and I have to say that Kevin Ranker from Skagit County, no, it's Island County. He represents San Juan Islands and also I think Mount Vernon area. He wrote a very good bill, and he's been a very good legislator down there pushing this issue, and it just came out of his committee. Went on the floor of the Senate, and this week it got passed 35-12 with Republican support. It was bipartisan. Unfortunately, it's not as clear-cut on the House side. On the House side, this bill was introduced. Actually, the most radical bill was introduced by 2 Republicans from the coast. They wanted an immediate shutdown of, and this is kind of interesting, seeing Republicans on the environmental side. It used to be, back in 1961, 62, you had a lot of Republicans like Bill Ruckelshaus, even John Ehrlichman of Nixon fame had one of the first environmental victories at Guaymas Island when he stopped the plans to put an aluminum plant up there. But now we're looking at national Republicans, and it's Trump and the EPA, and they're undoing all this stuff. But still, at the local level, you find, I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican, if they're connected to their constituents, they can look at this and say, this shouldn't be happening. So we had 2 Republicans that promoted an immediate ban, which probably would not have stood the test legally. And then we had, turned out, Christine Litton, who's also from that area, Anacortes, Mount Vernon. She introduced a bill that paralleled Kevin Ranker's bill in the House. Now, the chair of the committee that heard this bill initially is a guy named Brian Blake, who's a conservative Democrat from Southwest Washington, and he essentially, along with some help from some Seattle Democrats, he essentially gutted that bill and took out the provisions that would have phased out Atlantic salmon. And so it's called House Bill 2957. And, if you're in Joe Fitzgibbon's district like I am, you need to contact him and express your displeasure with him because he actually supported gutting that bill, as did Eric Pettigrew in the Rainier Valley. And so it came out of committee gutted, and there was a minority that opposed the gutted bill within the committee, including Christine Litton. So the hope now is that this thing, following the Senate passage of the ban and the governor's statement, which was very strong, that these don't belong here, we need to focus attention on the House side, and you need to call your representative. It's House Bill 2957. Right now, it's just a study bill, but we want to, through amendment, add back in that language that will phase these exotic species out of Puget Sound. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I've actually met with Cook Aquaculture about 2 weeks ago, myself and another fisherman. We were down at the Association of Washington Business, and we were hoping they would stay neutral. And so we sat down there, and we really couldn't find any common point of agreement. The Association of Washington Business said, well, why should you fishermen care if these net pens operate. And we said, the resource is dying from 1,000 cuts. You've got all the runoff, you've got the culverts that haven't been fixed. We've got endangered species. The Chinook are listed as a federally endangered species. If any fish is going to pick up disease from the net pens in Puget Sound, it's going to be the resident fish that are here longest, which are the Chinook. And so all these things impinge on our ability to harvest this public resource and bring it to the public. We should be thinking about a future which is more of a utopian future where we actually celebrate and augment the tremendous natural resource that we have here. Puget Sound is not just a platform for water skiing; that's a garden out there. And so, how do you explain that to the Association of Washington Business in a 15-minute meeting? But that's why. That's why. Basically, it's interesting looking at the political fault lines in terms of who is fighting this industry. You've got the tribes, especially the Lummies. The Lummies did terrific work sopping up these escaped Atlantics. And, of course, the other tribes are all concerned. Tulalipes are up there. You've got the Soxuyatl and others. So you've got those folks, and then you've got a pretty good environmental contingent testifying. The Sierra Club has been terrific. Audubon came out. Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. The Wild Fish Conservancy has been a central organizer in this Our Fish, Our Sound campaign. And then on the commercial fishing side, it's primarily the non-treaty small boat gill netters who are politically active. You don't hear too much from big salmon processors or the larger boat fishermen that fish for them. And it's kind of sad. You don't really hear much from sport fishermen either. There's some good sport groups like Trout Unlimited, but by and large, they haven't been present down there. So it's a coalition it's a pretty good coalition. And it's actually worthwhile going on TVW and looking up some of the hearings on the House Ag or Senate Ag Committee hearings, because there's some powerful testimony, especially the tribal testimony, very powerful.
We've also got our resident orca whales that are literally starving.
Yes.
There's not enough salmon for them.
Right. That's it. And their primary focus is Chinook salmon. Then maybe they'll switch and eat a Akita once in a while, but it's primarily Chinook. And so to have these invasive species, potentially disease transmitters, and by the way, there was a report that came out from the Department of Natural Resources looking at the Cypress Island fiasco, and all 4 of the escaped Atlantics that they sampled had that disease that we're worried about, Piscine orthoreovirus. And that was buried on page 98 of that report in a footnote. So there's some real concerns here. We need to get this thing under control.
All right. And the bill, again, that you're recommending people respond to?
It's called House Bill 2957. You can go to the legislative site and type in your address, and it will give you your representatives. And you need to email them and tell them that House Bill 2957, the provisions for Atlantic salmon phase out and need to be restored. There needs to be amendments to that bill. That basically we want to see a parallel bill to that just passed by the Senate and endorsed by the governor.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us again.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike, for all the great work you've done here, holding the fort down and Mind Over Matters. It's just been it's a tremendous part of Seattle political culture.
Thank you.